All right, so let's go ahead and begin. At this time, using your chat feature, please send to me present, to me, the host, so I know that you're here. Again, the purpose of these meetings is to go over some key information that we would have covered in the recorded lecture format this particular week, and provide you an opportunity to ask some live questions if you have any. So we'll be reviewing what we have done this week, sort of a summary and overview as well. And then we'll end up with a few reminders about what we need to look at next for this particular course and any other information I need to share with you. And then there'll be a more formal Q&A if there are any questions that I can address for you. Also, I'll try to remind you a little bit later to send me a message for present. I've noticed for a few of these sessions that a lot more people have been in attendance than have actually sent me a identification that they were present here. So I'll remind you about that a little bit later, hopefully. Okay, so basically one of the things I normally do as well is go over a few key ideas just to remind ourselves of the flow of this course. We have reading the textbook chapters, completing the quiz homeworks, reviewing the lecture notes that I provide to you, as well as the completing the discussions associated with the recorded lectures as well. And of course, there are several video course videos for you guys with regards to School of Life and Crash Course, a few discussions that are standalone discussions as well. I try to always provide a review document for you just prior to the module test. Okay. So what we're being talking about is something that most people are somewhat familiar with already, and that is going to be Freud. And Freud can be somewhat controversial. Sometimes people hate him for a variety of reasons, a lot of them dealing with the controversial ideas that he came up with. So what we're going to be doing today is going over some of those key concepts. So we want to look at Freud. And one of the things that you need to do before we can look at Freud successfully is to understand where this stuff that he comes up with came from. Basically, many of the elements that he put together to form his theory existed prior to him coming up with these ideas. The ideas were already out there. In fact, many would say the greatest genius of Freud was bringing together so many diverse approaches in a very systematic way, in a very integrated way, in order to communicate his beliefs and ideas as to what is one of the motivating influences behind human behavior. So most elements of the theory existed prior to him constructing his particular theory. And I want to go over a few individuals. Leibniz, he came up with the idea of levels of awareness from clear to unaware. Goethe, he basically talked about the continual struggle between conflicting emotions that individuals have within their life. Herbart discussed the threshold above which we are aware and below of which we are not aware. So these individuals, in one way or another, were describing one key idea or several key ideas that will become very important to the theory and the ideas of Freud later. And of course, Schopenhauer, that romantic is basically saying that we are governed more by the irrational and not the rational, not reason, that is going to be a more driving force behind our behavior than anything else. Nietzsche, the existentialist, also discussed this idea of this continual battle between our irrational nature and our rational nature. So what we see here are key ideas that Freud was able to, in a way, synthesize and repackage. And then we have Fechner, who previously had envisioned this notion of an iceberg to explain those things which are conscious and those things which are unconscious to us. And again, we've seen that iceberg numerous times that in relationship to describing the ideas that Freud articulated, but the initial idea for the iceberg came from Gustav Fechner. And then we have Helmholtz, who worked on the conservation of energy, influenced Freud's notion of psychic energy. So what we see here is a lot of ideas, and there's even more individuals too that influence Freud as well. We could include here Darwin. Uh, Freud was very much interested in a variety of things, such as evolutionary theory, irrational behavior, and of course, those internal conflicts that we saw others talk about previously. So all these ideas were out there in the world. And what Freud was good at being able to do is to be well read and interested enough to be aware of these ideas and pull them together to try to explain human behavior, human consciousness, and things of that nature. So when we talk about psychoanalysis, which is the main thing that we're talking about here, psychoanalysis formally started around 1895 when Freud, with his colleague Breuer, published studies in hysteria, which marked the beginning of Freud's own clinical studies. Now, as I'm sure you are aware, these were based on clinical observations, not laboratory observations. So psychoanalysis represents a separate paradigm from understanding the causes of human behavior, not based on laboratory work, but based on the clinical observations of patients that Freud had access to that were his own and also shared with other colleagues. So one of the things too that we want to also sort of go over real briefly here is the notion that Freud had many individuals influencing him. So they were influencers of Freud. So we not only have these ideas that are floating around there, but we also have the notion that these individuals served key roles in influencing Freud's ideas and their behaviors. As we've talked about before, at the very beginning of this course, psychologists are going to be influenced by many things, and they have their own past, their own training, which also will influence them. As we talked about at the very beginning of this course, we cannot be unbiased. So we're always going to be biased. So one's experience, one's individuals that they are in contact with will have some role in influencing our ideas. Obviously, he had relationships with his parents, and particularly his mother's always was a great influence on Freud. Ernst Brucker influenced Freud during his medical studies. Remember, Freud was medically trained. He was a physician that wound up working in the area of psychoanalysts. So the notion here is that these individuals did have some impact on the development of his ideas. Now, also, we're always familiar with, we always hear this, Freud experimented with cocaine. Ultimately, this did damage his reputation to some degree, as well as the acceptance of his work. He thought cocaine had very little side effects, and he thought it was something that would be useful to people. So this, again, did damage ultimately his reputation to some extent. He did get in the literature, at least one person that I'm aware of in the literature that started taking cocaine because of the influence of Freud to treat another addiction, allegedly. So Joseph Breuer was probably one of the most significant relationships that Freud had that influenced him. In fact, Breuer, again, was the colleague that worked with him on the studies in hysteria. And some would even say that he was sort of a co-founder to the ideas of psychoanalysis. So he worked with a particular patient, Anna O, which is somewhat of a famous patient. And this patient was one of the first case studies, I believe, mentioned in the studies of hysteria. And so a lot of the stuff that was developed in part came from her. And working with her, she had symptoms of hysteria such as paralysis of limbs, vision and hearing loss. Breuer was able to hypnotize Anna O and had her recall the circumstances that began these symptoms. Okay, and in doing that and going through that process, Breuer discovered that revealing the cause of the issues helped to relieve some of those symptoms, and that became the cathartic method, by unveiling and showing where these things came from, people can experience some degree of relief. During this phase as well, we saw the term of transference occurs when a person redirects some of their feelings or desires for another person to an entirely different person, where you have transference usually focused on the clinician. So in addition to that, we had Charcot, who was also a great influencer. He influenced Freud's approach to therapy. Now, one of the things that we see here is that hypnosis was being employed quite a bit early in their approaches to try to uncover things of the unconscious. But eventually they ran into sort of a roadblock with the idea that hypnosis was not fully or completely effective as they would hope. Now, hypnosis, as you may recall, was sort of accidentally discovered by an individual called Mesmer. I forget his first name right now, and that's where the name mesmerism comes from. So he developed this technique for hypnosis, which generated a lot of tremendous interest at the time. He lived from 1730s to 1815 or so. And Freud worked with pioneers in clinical application of this hypnosis. So he was one of the early adopters to this particular technique. But he did ultimately see that there were some issues that were not being able to get past some of the road barriers to get to the unconscious. And so that led them to examine other ways in which to tap into the unconscious, so to speak, and that was through free association. So free association was a process and technique employed to try to address some of the failures of hypnosis. And remember, one of the key goals of attempting to perform psychoanalysis work per Freud was to try to uncover the issues hidden in the unconscious. And so what these techniques are really trying to accomplish was trying to get to something that the patient or client might not even be fully aware of themselves. And so hypnosis was one method to get to this hidden unconscious issues, and free association was another. And basically the free association idea was just to get the patient or client to start talking. Okay, things come to mind without really thinking about stuff. Sometimes you could hear the notion of they would just say some things and you would say the first thing to come to mind without thinking about it. The idea is by using this free association, what is happening is these things are bubbling up from the unconscious, giving the clinician some clue as to what issues may be there in the unconscious. That's the basic premise behind these particular approaches. I'm going to pause there. I've been going at a roll here for a second, see if there are any type of issues. So what we see with free association, there are many individuals who may have some role in this. Charcot is one of the individuals normally associated with it. Fechner usually tends to be associated with his ideas of the unconscious. But again, you can see the whole point here that anyone that's interested in uncovering the unconscious, there are many ways in which they can be. Hypnosis being one, and then just through unguarded communication being another. Now think about what we mean by unguarded communication. If you're not watching what you say, then you can say a lot. And some of the things that you say, you may not be thinking about so clearly. And then what happens is, exactly as someone types here, is that Freudian slip, okay, where you may state something that you never really thought about consciously, but you may be feeling at a certain level. For example, let's say you and a friend are taking a class together, and after one of the first exams, what happens is they say, man, I really blew that exam. And you say, well, I'm glad you failed that. And then you realize what you just started to say. So that would be considered sort of a slip. that this is something that you don't say in polite company, but at some level, for whatever reason, it's floating around in your head. And at some unguarded moment where you're not censoring what you're saying, that you're not in conscious control of what ideas are popping up and what you're going to communicate to others, it slips out. So in a way, what they are attempting to do here through a variety of means is to, again, get to that unconscious stuff, to be able to tap into it by trying to get you to speak unguardedly so that you slip out something that may be festering, so to speak, in your unconscious, or by putting you into a highly state of suggestibility where they can crawl into your unconscious, so to speak, and ferret out these particular issues. Those are some of the things that were key to the notion of Freud's work. The unconscious played a pivotal role in understanding why it is that we do the things that we do, why it is that we have the problems that we have. So in addition to that, we need to understand the following, to sort of look at the evolution, so to speak, of how it is that we tap into the unconscious. So one of the key things that Freud came up with was, as a psychoanalyst, he believed to be very effective at psychoanalyzing other people, the psychoanalyst needed to also be psychoanalyzed. And so that left a sort of a logistical issue to some degree, because remember, he's sort of founding this particular area. And so there really weren't a great deal. Some would say, some of the research says there's only like one real psychoanalysis, and that was Freud. So how does he do it? How does he psychoanalyze himself? So some of the techniques could not be employed. Obviously, he had some issues with hypnosis, and hypnosis requires someone to hypnotize the person who's going on the hypnosis. And free association, he did not figure out a way in order to do that successfully as an individual. So he needed to figure out a way to analyze or self-analyze himself. And that's where he came up with dreams. He used dreams to self-analyze. And so this opened up a whole new area of exploration, one that even continues today. You can go to any bookstore, if people still do that type of thing, go to a bookstore and you will see entire sections where there'll be whole books on dream analysis, usually sometimes associated next to the self-improvement sections in these bookstores. So dream analysis still has a firm footing today even, but it was popular back then as well. So he came up with a method to analyze his dreams. So we have the manifest content, and this is what actually happens in a dream. So some of you remember their dreams that you had this morning. In fact, as you know, you had numerous dreams during your sleep process last night, and you most likely tend to remember the one that you had last and the one that you wake up from. Okay, and as you recall that dream, whatever went on in that dream, the actions that were taken, the things that were in it, the people that were in it, as you describe that dream, that is the manifest content, what actually happened during the dream. It is what it is. But then you have the latent content, and this is the symbology, and this is what the dream actually really means. So the person that you had in your dream that represented your spouse or your significant other, but it wasn't them, but you know that represents. So we know in dreams, sometimes you know there's a person there that it's somebody that you know really well, but it's not them. But you know that person is a symbol for them. And all the actions that go on to doing that dream may have other meanings. And so it was going to be the analyst's job to try to uncover what the dream actually means. Again, this is getting or tapping into that unconsciousness there. Now, when it comes to dreams, Freud believed that these dreams were wish fulfillment, that every dream is a wish fulfillment, a symbolic expression of a wish that the dreamer could not express or satisfy directly without experiencing anxiety. So the idea here is that as you're sleeping and you're in your unguarded personal moments and your unconscious is allowed to fly free, so to speak, and the dreams that result from that could be dreams based on things that you don't want to think about in your conscious waking self, because they would produce too much anxiety and they would cause problems because they're inappropriate or something of that nature. So we see here that Freud sort of paints a picture of people sort of like continually in struggle with themselves, and struggle with their sort of baser needs and baser desires. And that is, to an extent, what he sort of prescribes, that's what's going on. All right, I'm going to pause there to see if there are any questions or comments. So are there any? You can send me a chat or unmute and ask a question or provide a comment. Okay, so we seem to be sans any comments right now. So what we've seen so far is sort of this exploration of the unconscious, trying to tap into the unconscious to see what's going around in there, so that issues can be brought into the light of day, so to speak, and have some relief for the patient. Now, a couple of other ideas is that we have this notion called psychopathology of everyday life. So the way I see this is how it is that in our everyday life can we see these things sort of reveal themselves, and how is it that we sort of deal with certain types of things. So let's talk about humor. Humor is an important aspect of life to some extent, that we see that humor pops up in a variety of ways, but sometimes humor can be somewhat biting and aggressive. And what we see here is that he sort of described humor that sometimes will display some unacceptable sexual or aggressive tendencies. If you've ever been around someone who makes a really bad joke, an inappropriate joke, or one that could be interpreted as such, well, that is what Freud would be describing here, is that this humor, these jokes, these types of things that people say may reveal some things that are more inappropriate, that may be going around in the unconscious. Now, one other idea before I move on, there was a question here about people writing dreams off as it's pseudoscience. And for the most part, the researchers out there would say that dream analysis is not real science. Okay, that it's, I mean, we know when we have a dream, we know sometimes exactly what the dream's about. Okay, we can know that it's symbolizing something that's going on with us personally, but the idea of analyzing the dreams and it having some major symbolic meaning, current research, as I understand it, is not fully supportive of that idea. That it is something that we don't want to put too much effort in. Okay, but obviously we are intelligent enough to know that if you're having a continual dream over and over again, and you sort of can piece together what it means, it is you probably trying to tell you something about something that's going on in your life. Okay, so it's from that extent, not reading too much into it, but just reading the symbols, it could be somewhat beneficial, but not the way that it has been portrayed in the past. So in addition to this psychopathology of everyday life, we see also religion. He sees that this religion and the focus on religion to an extent is based on us feeling helpless and insecure, that we need to have something that we can sort of hold on to sort of deal with that. And obviously we can see this happening in a variety of times. I mean, even now and today, with the pandemic and all the stuff that's going on, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are feeling somewhat lost and very insecure and very small and helpless when it comes to the things that are happening around them. But definitely we do see that Freud had ideas as to how certain things reveal themselves in our everyday life. Now, I have here a series of lectures. The reason I have this here is because this series of lectures that happened at Clark University sort of helped to put Freud and his theories on the map. So Clark University held a series of lectures from some prominent individuals in the area of psychology at the time, and Freud was one of the invitees. And he gave a series, I think it was like 5 lectures on his work, and it was well received. And it helped to popularize Freud and his ideas. In fact, in some regards, he was more popular than some of the other movements of psychology at the time. In fact, the research that I've read recently suggests that Freud was more popular than behaviorism was at its sort of height. Freud was still out there because he did communicate a few ideas that people could relate to when it comes to their everyday life, such as defense mechanisms and things of that nature, that we see that there's so much that people realize, for example, when they have to deal with the anxieties of their life. And we'll see that in the next slide here. So Freud, focusing on the unconscious, having this approach to trying to get at the ideas going on in the unconscious. So let's look at his theory. And one of the key things, and why we talk about him so much, he was one of the first to sort of come up with a cohesive theory of personality. And so first, we have this notion of the unconscious, things that are going around in our unconscious level that we are not aware of, that can then be brought to the pre-conscious, things just outside of our awareness that can be brought into our conscious awareness. All right, and that's the key thing. Now, just to give you a little bit of background here, I talk about this in my 210 class recently, actually, so I'll bring it up. Remember, when we talk about conscious and unconscious here, we want to remember that we have these 2 levels or 2 tracks of mind, so to speak. And what I mean by that is we have the unconscious and we have the conscious, the 2 tracks of our mind. And there are so many things that we can process at an unconscious level, and we do that all the time. We're not consciously aware of them, even though we have access to that information as a person. For example, you may recall blind sight. Blind sight is when someone is blind, but they're not blind because the eyeballs or the optic nerve or the retina is having some sort of issue. That equipment works just fine. They're blind because they're not able to process the visual information in their occipital lobe, okay? But when you put those individuals who have blind sight in a hallway and you put obstacles in front of them and you tell them to walk, they'll walk, but they will avoid those obstacles, because the idea here is that they have some level of awareness, not conscious awareness, but awareness that allows them to avoid those types. They may not know why they're walking this way in the hallway to avoid things, but they can because they do have access to the information, or parts of their brain have access, even though they're not consciously aware of it. Okay, so when it comes down to this notion of pre-conscious, someone asked the question, how can we distinguish the pre-conscious and consciousness? Just thinking about those things, which is almost like on the tip of you having it being brought into your consciousness. Think of it that way. It's almost like a version of the tip of the tongue phenomena, where it's almost there and then you bring it in. So that pre-conscious idea is describing that process by which there's something that at one point was not something that you were consciously aware of, and then is now getting the process of being brought into your conscious awareness. Just before it's been brought in, it's pre-conscious. Think of it this way. When you are pulling something out of your long-term memory, it is at one point, you're not consciously aware of it. But then when you're pulling out long-term memory, it slowly becomes more aware to you consciously until it's brought into your memory. So in a way, it can be thought of like that. So He first developed the idea of this conscious, unconscious, preconscious, which later developed into him explaining the ideas of the id, ego, and superego. And of course, we are familiar with those particular characters. The id being the thing that sort of drives our basic needs. The idea of the id is this the driving force of our personality, containing all our instinctive types of behavior driven by this pleasure principle. Whereas the ego sort of is us, and the ego we see is aware of the needs of the id, but also aware of the needs of the real world, the world out there, the world in our environment, and has to sort of be the mediator between the irrational desires of the id, but also sometimes the irrational ideals of the superego. And again, the superego is where we have these internalized rules and regulations of our society, of our parents, when we internalize that. So remember, when we are born with our id, okay? It's all about doing things that are fun for us as we're crawling around on the floor as a young person. And then slowly, as we become more self-aware, we start to develop our ego. And then as we internalize the rules of our society that we learn through our parents or our caretakers, then the super ego sort of develops. And that is where we sort of develop all this type of stuff. Now, the instincts that are part of the id are going to be things like life and death, eros and thanatos, that these things are going to be driving our behavior. All right. Again, these are in the unconscious, and so we don't always know why we're doing the things that we do, because these unconscious instinct things are driving our behavior. So that is how he sort of initially designed, and the ideas that he had about the theory of personality, from his focus on the levels of consciousness, then to the id, ego, and superego, and those types of things. So now that we have this ego, this thing that sort of helps to manages these things for us, then he talks about how the ego defends itself. And this is one of the things too, I think, that people was able to sort of latch on to, because it's something that people can relate to. At least one or many of you have probably used one of these defense mechanisms already sometime this week. Okay, so what it comes down to is he talked about these three types of anxiety that we can have. Objective anxiety, where there is a real objective threat from the outside. Neurotic anxiety, where the ego is being overwhelmed by the id, as an example. And then moral anxiety, where the superego or the internalized values are being violated or will be violated soon, that causes anxiety, this discomfort, this sort of internal conflict that we have. And remember, the ego's job is to deal with anxiety by, one, dealing with the environment for objective anxiety. So there's something that's causing some anxiety and it's a real objective type of thing, then the ego has to figure out some way to deal with it. Or it could be neurotic and moral anxiety. It has to do something to deal with it. So you don't have something out in the real world, so to speak, that you can address and do something with. You have to do something with it elsewhere. And what the ego does here, it employs these defense mechanisms to do that. Now, defense mechanisms, I decided not to cover that too much in this overview, but you guys are familiar with the defense mechanisms. One of them would be denial. Okay, and denial is a simple form of defense mechanism, where it involves blocking external events from awareness. If some situation is just too much to handle, the person just refuses to experience it. They just deny the existence of it. Let me give you an example I use often in my 210 class about denial. Let's say, sounds somewhat sexist here now that I think about it, but you're visiting some friend, and she's doing laundry. So it's a female friend. She's doing laundry, and you know these friends, you've been friends with years, and you know that she doesn't wear a stick of makeup. and she is doing, I know this sounds so sexist, the husband's shirt or something, and there's a big lob of lipstick on the collar. You notice it as the friend, and your mouth just falls open because you realize what that potentially means. Okay, but you see your friend is treating the lipstick stain on the collar of her husband's shirt, but not saying anything about it. She just robotically cleans it up and puts it into the washer. That could be an example of denial. She went through the rote behavior. She might not even remember it. Okay, so the notion here is that that is a defense mechanism, something that is too problematic, too shocking, too dangerous for you to be aware of. Therefore, you are not aware of it. That's what that is all about. And so that is the power of these defense mechanisms. And so defense mechanisms is one way in which uh, the work of Freud was somewhat popularized simply because people could relate to those types of things. They could understand that they probably did some of those things. Again, I mean, rationalization is one that we all do. Rationalization where we come up with a better reason for a certain behavior that we've done as opposed to the real actual reason that we did it. All right, so the notion here is that it's better and just easier just to come up with a reason that is highfalutin and very good for you, that this is why I did this. This is why I kept the money that I found on the sidewalk. Not because I wanted to buy a new big screen TV, because I found out that this money most likely is drug money from this neighborhood, and it's good for me to keep it out of the evil people's hands. Okay, rationalization. So again, what these ego defense mechanisms are doing, they're just simply trying to protect you from the anxiety. They're relieving you of the anxiety by either, in this case, denying the existence of the lipstick on the collar, or in the other instance, by denying that you are keeping this money just to buy something that you want. But no, you're keeping this money out of the hands of some really, really bad people. So again, it is how, as someone points out here, it is how we deal with painful truths. We don't want to deal with them, so we sort of adjust the reality of them in some fashion by using defense mechanisms. So those are some of the key ideas I wanted to cover about Freud. Now I want to move a little bit now into chapter 11 about Wilhelm Wundt. Now, Wundt, as you know, is the individual who is considered to be the founder, in a sense, the inaugurator, in a sense, of the discipline of psychology. There were plenty of things going on well before him that could have been the date that was selected as to the start of psychology. But as we'll see, there were specific reasons why this was chosen as opposed to those other previous events. So Wilhelm Wundt studied with individuals like Johann Mueller, who we discussed before, as well as Helmholtz. His approach to psychology, Wundt's approach to psychology was that of voluntarism, because of its focus on will, choice, purpose, the things that we choose to do. That was one key idea that Wundt proposed, that these are the things that we want to focus on. So he created this first psychology lab in 1879, and the importance and significance of it is this. You had a university allotting space, resources, and support for the study exclusively of psychology, experimental psychology. And that was a very, very big deal. And as you've probably gathered in your tour through psychology, that you guys are upperclassmen here, is that a lot of psychology depends a great deal on what happens in the academic area of psychology, as they come up with theories, as they do the basic research that will later become applied research and things of that nature. So in a sense, by establishing that first psychology lab, it sort of started the academic discipline of psychology, and that's why it was most likely selected as the date for the start of the field of psychology. All right. So in this lab that Wundt created, he studied basic and higher order thinking as well as applied issues. He took a diverse achievements of other researchers and his own early research on attention and synthesized them into a sort of a unified research program. And the focus of everything that he was doing during this research program, he stressed selective attention, the things that we select to attend to, aka volition. Now, this, somewhat not controversial, but there are some differences here. In some of the literature, we talk about uh, uh, volunteerism being the first school of thought, but the more structured first school of thought is usually always going to be identified as structuralism. But what it came down to, I want to first emphasize what we mean by a school. A school can be defined as a group of individuals who share common assumptions, work on common problems, and use sort of common methods and sort of understand how it is that things get done, so to speak. And that is what sort of defines the school as we use it in psychology in the early days. So some of the research that he worked on, a lot of research directions. He looked at psychophysics, the measurements of sensation, psychometry, the duration of how long mental process took, our sense of time, the idea of time relations of perceptions, estimation of intervals of time. Think about it this way. We all know that time is relative because a bunch of smart people tell us this, but also think of it this way. Sometimes when you're in a situation, time flies by. It goes rather quickly. It's like you look up and it's over. Where sometimes time just drags on and on and on. So we know, at least from our own perception, that our time sense does change. And then he also looked at the association of ideas, the time it takes from one idea to lead to or suggest another. So he had a variety of types of things that he was exploring and examining in the area of psychology early on. And it was very important to realize that as he opened up these labs, everyone who had some interest in psychology, a lot of the more important figures of the day, would wind up going and flocking to Wundt to study in his labs. So he was able to influence a great deal, a great many of the early minds, sort of the great grandfathers, so to speak, of psychology, who were then spread out from his labs in Leipzig, Germany, back to their own territories, and then communicate those ideas to the people that they in turn would train as well. So what Wundt saw as the goal of psychology during this time was to understand both the simple, the basic processes of the mind, and the complex, the higher mental processes of these conscious phenomena. Now, he made sure that we understood that for simple phenomena, which he was studying in his labs, he could use experimentation. Okay, that's what he did. He used experimentation there. But for more complex phenomena, he did not think that experimentation could be conducted. He used various forms of naturalistic observation by analyzing artworks or laws or things of that nature. So he had to do somewhat more of an indirect approach to studying these higher levels of mental processes. But there were two types of experience that he was interested in: immediate experience, data obtained via measuring devices and thus not direct. They're mediated. And then the immediate experience. Data are events in human consciousness as they occurred. And that was, for him, the focus and subject matter of psychology. He wanted to look at the immediate experience. So I have down here just a quick example. I do not immediately hear the truck coming down the street. I immediately hear the sound. The sound is the thing which is the immediate experience. By the time you say truck, that is going to be your perception. It has been mediated by many other things. Your past experiences of similar sounds, where you're located, that you're not in your bedroom, you're out near the street or the road. You piece all these things together, bam, it's a truck. All right, so that's the difference here, the immediate experience versus the mediated experience. And so one is going to be the sensation, the immediate thing that sort of impinges on your sense receptors, and then what you make sense of it, your perception of it. I'm going to pause real briefly there to see if there are any questions so far. Either you can send me a chat or unmute. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep moving on then. We shouldn't be too much longer here. All right, so when we see those are what he was studying, these immediate experiences, he wanted to then look at certain methodologies that were being employed. So he used a form of introspection. And introspection, as we most of us first hear about it in a general psych course, is very low level, just reporting what you are experiencing, sensing at the time. His was not that type. In fact, introspection here most oftentimes is going to be described like this. In most instances, the subject will respond to a simple response such as yes or no, or simply by pressing a key. Now, that is in many ways somewhat still subjective if you think about it. You don't know when somebody actually experiences something. They have to still tell you. They tell you by yes, I saw it, or no, I didn't see it, or they have to press a key. It's still somewhat mysterious because it's going on inside someone's head. So these responses were made without any description of internal events, but from their perspective, it was still somewhat introspection. So these were what was used to study the immediate experience. So they would do something like they would drop some sort of object onto a hard platform, and you were supposed to hit a key once you sensed the sound that it made once it hit the hard platform. And they would measure the time it took. And then they would do the same thing, but they would say now, as opposed to you hearing the sound and then hitting the key, then when you become aware of the sound, then hit the key. And then they would measure the differences between you hearing the sound or becoming aware that you heard the sound. And then they would have these two different times, and they would make an assumption about how long it took for you to process some sort of information. So he also broke it down to having two basic types of mental experience. We have the sensations, the sense organ is stimulated and the impulse reaches the brain. And then we have the feelings that accompany these sensations and can be described along the three dimensions according to the tridimensional theory of feelings, which he came up with: pleasantness versus unpleasantness, excitement versus calm, and strain versus relaxation. So what this takes us to is a couple other ideas that are important for us to sort of understand to an extent. So he was all about what it is that we are perceiving, what we focus on, what we attend to, and what we apperceive. So let's look at what these terms actually sort of mean here. So perception, he sees it as a passive process, what we perceive. So when we perceive truck, okay, our perception of truck in the scenario I gave to you earlier was the stimulation present. Okay, it could be the sound and whatever visual things that we're seeing there, plus the physiology of the person, meaning, for example, do I require a hearing aid for the sound? Do I require glasses for seeing the truck? These things also play a significant role in what we're going to perceive. And then our personal experience. That means our training, past events that have occurred in our life. Okay, maybe last time, recently within the last 3 months, I was hit in my car by a truck. So all these things come together: the stimulation present, the physiological background and makeup of the person, your personal experiences, all this comes together to form your perception. That sort of makes up what he refers to as the perceptual field. Now, what is meant by this term apperceived? Apperceived is what the person attends to, What do you focus on? So unlike perception, perception is very passive. Things just happen and you go through and you perceive something. But here with apperception, when you apperceive something, it is what you are looking at, what you are attending to. He sees this as a voluntary process. Remember how we started off this particular section? Voluntarism, volition, what you choose to focus on or whatever you focus on. That is the voluntarism. That's where that comes from, the voluntary process, an active process that we go through. He describes this idea of creative synthesis. The elements which are attended to can be arranged and rearranged as a person wills. Thus, arrangements not experienced before can be produced. This is an idea that we've seen a couple of times already in previous lectures, where we have these things that are simple things that can be made up and rearranged and added to in certain ways to produce a new experience. So here, what we're saying through creative synthesis, elements which are attended to can be arranged and rearranged by however the person wants, so that you can experience something that was not previously experienced. Creative synthesis. So those are some of the basic ideas that Wundt sort of established as he began doing his research in the early days of psychology and the rise of experimental psychology. So last few things as we wrap up the ideas of the rise of psychology here that we want to go over. So psychology was about human existence, not helping people. Okay, this would be a very important idea that we'll see in the next chapter when we talk more about what is thought of as the first school of psychology, structuralism. So psychology was about human existence, not helping people. All right, it was modeled as best as it could be after the natural sciences. We've seen this before as well, where in order to make psychology more scientific, they always keep wanting to model it after the science of the day, the natural sciences, because that was much more acceptable and that made sense. And we want to see how does the mind and brain work. It was what they were focused on. The mind is not a location, but a process. And why 1879, as I mentioned earlier, why this being the birth of psychology? Because of the idea of space and resources being provided for something exclusively designed to study and work within the area of experimental psychology. He wanted to find causal explanations for psychological phenomena. He did not rely on introspection a great deal, as we see of introspection today. And again, one of the key things that he did do, he taught many people his techniques and taught others. So the idea is that he sort of was a instrumental figure in the early days of psychology that got sort of the best minds and brightest minds of the day to learn what he had learned, what he had pieced together about how psychology was to be done, and then they would go out and spread their own ideas. One of the individuals that was there was going to be William James, who we'll see in a few chapters, because William James is sort of seen as sort of like the key grand poobah, so to speak, of psychology over here in America, who is greatly associated with functionalism, even though there's someone else who's much more associated with functionalism, which we'll see a little bit later. All right, so a couple of things I want to do before I ask to see if there are any questions out there about what we just talked about or any other material. Your exam 3 is posted. It was posted for a while now, as well as a study guide is available for it. Next, we'll be looking at module number 4. We'll have 2 weeks, which will be double weeks, meaning that we're going to be looking at 2 chapters next week and then the week after. Chapter 12 is going to be on Titchener, introspection, and positivism. And then chapter 13 will be on Gestalt psychology. Chapter 14, the next week after that, will be on William James and the stream of consciousness. And then we'll look at functionalism and Dewey, who's the individual who's most often associated with really being the foundation of functionalism here. Now, I'll pause there to see if there are any questions or comments about where we've been this week and what we're going to be doing the next couple of weeks. Any questions? Okay, one last comment there. I'm grading your papers now, and I didn't realize how tough it would be for me this semester with 2 online classes basically and a lot of paper assignments. I'm thinking about cutting down on some of the requirements there, so I'll keep you posted on that. But you should start seeing some of your grades for this uh, I think it was exam 3, I think, not exam 3, but essay 3. You'll be seeing some of the posts for those grades soon. All right, are there any questions now? Okay, if there are no questions, you guys have a great weekend. I'll see you later, and stay safe, okay? Bye-bye.